In 1990, following secret talks with the South African government, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He had been locked away for 27 years. Now he took part in negotiations that he hoped would soon lead to a new constitution and democratic elections.
When I came out, there was naturally a great surge of optimism on the part of our people. They could see that this was the beginning of a new era.
The enemies of change fought back. They provoked violence in the black townships and threatened Mandela's party, the ANC, in its heartlands.
Through the violence, the ANC was not able at the time to mobilize effectively throughout the country. People were becoming disillusioned.
The ruling National Party, who had devised the apartheid system to exclude blacks from power, now tried to hang on to their privileged position. Even worse was to come. Mandela and his party faced other threats, from white extremists and from blacks who felt left out of the political process.
When I said we're not going to participate, I meant that we're not going to participate. Simple as that.
After the euphoria of Mandela's release, the country seemed poised on the edge of disaster.
The whole world, quite frankly, thought this thing in South Africa would not work. The divisions were too deep, the historic anger too profound.
Mandela and the ANC would have to use all their brute force and political cunning to win the battle to shape the new South Africa.
I can no longer explain.
In June 1992, Nelson Mandela, president of the ANC, broke off negotiations with South Africa's ruling National Party, whom he blamed for the political violence.
Which is murdering our people.
The ANC took their arguments to the streets. Harnessing black anger at the surge in politically motivated bloodshed, they launched a campaign of rolling mass action. For 2 months, rallies, sit-ins and strikes mobilized hundreds of thousands of people.
We saw various and manifold acts of defiance, strikes, occupations of government offices, sit-ins in the streets, preventing the traffic from flowing.
The huge demonstrations proclaimed the extent of the ANC's mass support. A general strike and a week of nationwide protests brought South Africa to a standstill. The week culminated in a march on the government's headquarters in Pretoria.
The whole concept of rolling mass action caught fire throughout the country. And our structures were energized. They were all pushing for one goal. And that was, if need be, to bring the apartheid regime down.
Next, the ANC turned its sights on a hated feature of South Africa's system, the tribal states, black puppet regimes created by the architects of apartheid. The government of one, Ciskei, was stopping the ANC from organizing on its territory. A march was organized on Bishu, the capital of Ciskei, which a decade earlier had been granted nominal autonomy.
Bishu was about unarmed people peacefully demonstrating, moving into this false creation and holding a people's assembly. We had 100,000 people moving intent on going through its false borders, past police lines, and holding the assembly in the center of Bishu itself. When we advanced up the hill, we saw these lines of soldiers, heavily armed, and we felt that they were not going to shoot.
All hell broke loose because Opagozo soldiers started shooting. Many of us were terrified. I've never been as terrified as I was. I thought I was actually quite close to death.
The massacre by this vassal state, televised worldwide, claimed 28 lives and severely embarrassed the government of President F.W. de Klerk. It was the climax to 4 months of trauma.
The whole world, quite frankly, thought this was it. This was the doom prophets had predicted by then that, look, this thing in South Africa would not work. The divisions were too deep, the historic anger too profound.
But the government was past the point of no return. It could not re-ban the ANC, and it could not put Mandela back in prison.
So FW said in a cabinet meeting, this cannot continue any longer. We must get the ANC back to the negotiating table. We must talk to them.
To ease tensions, President de Klerk appointed a younger, more flexible chief negotiator, Rolf Meyer. He was on good terms with the ANC's Cyril Ramaphosa. To keep channels open during the mass action campaign, the two men had held a series of secret meetings.
The fact that Cyril Ramaphosa and myself knew each other, and that we by then already had a sort of a working relationship, helped us to keep contact.
He saw the necessity of keeping the talks on course. And he also realized that the policies that the National Party stood for were unworkable and they would never be accepted by the ANC and indeed by the general public.
The Meyer-Ramaphosa talks laid the ground for a summit meeting between de Klerk and Mandela to get the constitutional negotiations going again. Confident that the ANC now held the initiative, Mandela insisted that the summit must meet 3 outstanding demands.
These 3 constitute the core of the demands we have submitted to the government. Unless they are met satisfactorily by the government, negotiations cannot, and will not resume.
The demands were hard for de Klerk to swallow. The first was for the release of all remaining ANC prisoners, including some who had committed terrorist atrocities in the 1980s. The day before de Klerk and Mandela were due to meet, the ANC negotiators assembled at their headquarters in Johannesburg.
Comrade Mandela and FW were on the phone at least 4 to 5 times that afternoon. President de Klerk came around with all sorts of technical arguments why it couldn't be done. He needed to see the Minister of Justice, and even then it would have to conform to the law. What about the definition of political prisoner, etc.?
But our president was as tough as nails. He was incredibly stubborn and really hard on the issue of the release of the political prisoners.
My colleagues now were doubtful. They felt that my stand would sabotage the summit, which was very important. But I was confident.
He knew that they had reached a point where we could break them.
De Klerk wanted us more than we wanted him. And he desperately needed that summit. And I was not prepared to have him to get to that summit without paying a price for it.
The other two ANC demands were aimed at Inkatha, the Zulu political party led by Chief Buthelezi. During the apartheid era, Inkatha had been the allies of the ruling National Party. Since the freeing of Mandela, Inkatha had stirred up violence and killings in the townships. Now the ANC insisted that Inkatha warriors be banned from carrying their so-called traditional weapons, and that razor-wire fencing be put around their hostels.
What it meant was that the hostels were going to be converted openly like Nazi camps, like concentration camps.
The summit took place without Buthelezi. It was the government and the ANC that had to reach agreement before the constitutional talks could resume.
Important day.
Oh, very important indeed. It's actually crucial.
De Klerk was in a jam. He needed the ANC, but if he acceded to Nelson Mandela's demands, he risked losing the support of Inkatha.
De Klerk kept on saying that he hadn't consulted his other ministers, and he hadn't fully read the document and needed time to do so. And our president insisted that he must study it there and then and append his signature jointly with him.
He was so calm. He just said, well, Mr. de Klerk, Mr. President, if that's the position, it's fine. But when we end this meeting and go to have the press conference, I shall have to say to the public that this meeting has been a total failure.
At no stage did I do anything because of a threat of a walkout. My commitment was to make that negotiation succeed through a process of give and take.
I think de Klerk knew that they were very vulnerable on this matter, and if they did not sign the record of understanding, everything would fall apart.
De Klerk gave way on all 3 points. Over the next few weeks, 300 prisoners were released. He agreed to fence key Inkatha hostels and to ban their traditional weapons. It was a watershed moment. The deal produced a reversal of political partnerships.
That, without any shadow of doubt, was the turning point of the whole negotiation process.
From that moment on, the two parties involved in managing the process were the National Party and the ANC.
18 months after Mandela's release from prison, close collaboration between the National Party and the ANC finally began.
We started having what we call boss berats, that is, talks away in the bush, between the ANC and the government, to try and thresh out outstanding issues.
It was probably for many of our ANC counterparts the first time that they flew in government aeroplanes. It was also significant because it was the first time that we flew together in any aeroplane whatsoever.
They went to a remote game lodge. One of the ANC negotiators was Joe Slovo, chairman of the Communist Party. The party had been allied with the ANC for decades. Slovo was on the ANC's executive. He had supported the Soviet invasions of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. As chief of staff of the ANC's armed wing, he had sent guerrillas into action and made fiery funeral speeches.
To crush, once and for all, those who are responsible for so much mourning.
Slovo's reputation still sent shivers down the spines of government members at the conference.
I went to the swimming pool and found a stranger in the swimming pool, and I wanted to walk away from it when I discovered that this was Joe Slovo. Slovo noticed me, and I had no option but to join him. Now that I felt extremely uncomfortable about, because Joe Slovo, the communist, the terrorist, what would my Late father have said about this, a staunch policeman, terrorist hunter, his son in the swimming pool with this communist terrorist.
But Slovo, now ill with cancer, had surprised everyone by revealing himself to be a pragmatist. Writing in a party journal, he had proposed a compromise to break the deadlock. A sunset clause in the new constitution which would provide for compulsory power sharing for a fixed number of years, before fading out like the setting sun. At the Bush conference, the National Party showed interest.
We realized that in the final instance, the major breakthrough that we have to make in this country was to find a settlement with the ANC. That's the reality.
We used to go in for a degree of jollification in the evenings, spend a bit of time in the pub together at night, and obviously, when you are negotiating with people and you create that kind of social rapport, things become easier and you get to know them, you get to understand each individual a little better.
During the conference, tentative agreement was reached on arrangements for organizing a free and fair election.
So Joe Slovo has been very instrumental in advocating a system where we could remove the fears of the minorities in the country and also moderate the arrogance of a majority, of a black majority.
While the government and the ANC worked on a deal that would calm the fears of the whites, Zulu chief Buthelezi protested that he had been betrayed and broke off contact with de Klerk.
Nowhere can a government in a country pick on one party and go into the bush and make a pact, a record of understanding, to the exclusion of other parties.
Now Buthelezi formed an alliance with other tribal state leaders who felt the government had abandoned them. They found allies among white extremist groups. All had armed forces of their own. They would supply the biggest threat to South Africa's transition to democracy.
Geen ding moet die wêreld daar buitekant weet. Ons kan nie sonder vryheid lewe en as dit dan moet, dan sal ons hom vat met die geweld waar dit werk.
Eugene Terreblanche was the leader of the South Africa's Afrikaner resistance movement, the AWB. The AWB wallowed in the symbolism of aggression and white supremacy. They drew their strength from fears among white Afrikaners that their government was selling out to the African National Congress.
We were sure that one or another time the government will capitulate and hand over the country to the communist forces.
Fearing they would be swamped by the ANC's advance, the AWB planned to form a breakaway state for the Afrikaners.
My people, the Afrikaner folk, really has a right, according to international law, to demand some part of this land as their own. You have a place where a Brit can be British. I must have land where the Afrikaner, the Boer, can be a Boer.
In April 1993, formal negotiations on the future of South Africa began in the World Trade Center near Johannesburg. The ANC and government had agreed that after the election, a power-sharing coalition of major parties would run the country for 5 years. Other parties had to accept that.
There were, at the multi-party talks, 26 parties altogether. But every level-headed South African knew that essentially the settlement would come through what the government and the ANC could agree upon or not. The one had the power and the other one had the majority support.
The key negotiators, the ANC's Cyril Ramaphosa and the National Party's Rolf Meyer, had become a double act known as the Rolf and Cyril Show. Right-wing Afrikaners saw them as a threat. A more moderate advocate of Afrikaner separatism was Constant Viljoen. He and Terreblanche both belonged to an alliance of more than 20 right-wing movements, the Afrikaner Volksfront. Viljoen was a former chief of the South African Defence Force and a war hero. In June 1993, after giving due notice to the authorities, Viljoen took a petition to the multi-party conference.
We were going to hand over at the World Trade Center some demands by the Volksfront. In other words, to have self-determination for the Afrikaner people. That was the intention.
The AWB were among the petitioners.
Then when the gates went open, the people started moving in, and then people started running.
Terre Blanche was leading the AWB contingent.
And we tried to stop the crowd in front of the building. I actually ran ahead myself because I realized what was taking place and I was going to stop them, and I did so. I got on top of a pole and I sort of signaled to all the people, and they did stop. And the whole crowd would have stopped in a very orderly manner. And then some AWB members on a vehicle came through. They ignored the warnings to stop.
They look like they're invading the place. Oh, look at it!
All of a sudden, I saw the security people running out, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, they've broken through and they're coming. And then my own security man simply grabbed hold of me and ran.
Pandemonium just broke out in the entire building. Many people on the ANC side, from the government side, all huddled into the government offices. We thought the right-wingers would never dare just march into government offices and start accosting people or assaulting them. And in fact, we even feared that we would be shot at.
The AWB overwhelmed the police, who retreated before them.
Signs of glass and everything shattering and everything, and reports coming through that they are looking for us, particularly Rolf and Cyril.
Terrified delegates barricaded themselves in their offices. In the conference chamber, the AWB chanted and daubed slogans demanding a separate white state. Ministers were compelled to promise Terre Blanche there would be no arrests. Only then did he agree to take his men out.
Now, this had caused not only a collapse of what we had intended, but what was intended to be something for the attention of the world, then was turned against us.
I was able to discuss the events with some of the National Party ministers. And they, in the end, I think, drove them more and more away from having any form of understanding or even sympathy with the right-wingers.
Soon after the invasion, the negotiators agreed that an election should be held the following April.
I believe I have Mr. Mayor's support.
With the ANC growing in confidence and looking certain to win the election, the National Party had retreated bit by bit on nearly all its power-sharing demands. One remained. The National Party insisted that its white minority ministers must have the power to block ANC decisions in cabinet. They called this governing by consensus.
It was the one issue on which the ANC was not prepared to make a concession on. That is, the cabinet should be able to take decisions by majority rather than by consensus as they had originally wanted it.
When the last day of the conference came, Ramaphosa was convinced the government's negotiators, headed by Rolf Meyer, could not afford to take the blame for a breakdown.
We therefore realized that this was their weak point and pressed on very hard until we finally got them to agree in the very early hours of the morning to that cabinet should be able to take decisions by majority rather than on a consensus basis.
This meant if the ANC won the election, the National Party would not be able to dilute their policies. The proposal was put to the existing cabinet for endorsement.
It was a very emotional moment for me. I think it was also an emotional moment for State President de Klerk. I voiced the concern that we maybe eventually end up as National Party being co-opted into an ANC government.
I took the decision and gave the lead that what we should go for is what is now in the Constitution.
As the conference wound up with the ANC triumphant, Ramaphosa celebrated his 41st birthday.
I was able to see Rolf Meyer for the first time dancing on the floor where we were having this party. He was quite happy, he was quite jovial, and I kept wondering whether I would have been as happy as he was if I was in his position, having finally given in the way that they had.
The National Party and the ANC negotiators were satisfied they had struck a workable deal. Now the election could proceed. But the enemies of democracy had other ideas. Terror Blanche threw all his weight into stopping the election. At a rally at the Pretoria Monument to Afrikaner pioneers, he said if Mandela wanted war, he would get war.
Ons het nie nodig om te verduidelik dat ons wit is. God het ons so gemaak en trou as sy kinders staan ons daarby. Ons geagte meneer die voorsitter het nie nodig om grond te vra. Ons het grond. Ons is die beskawers van Suid-Afrika. Ons is nie bereid om in 'n verkiesing in te gaan waar die ANC die boere se koppe tel.
The Volksfront looked for allies, and they found them in a surprising place. In the tribal states which had been created by the apartheid regime. These tribal states were to be abolished on election day. Of the 10 tribal states around the country's periphery, the most populous was KwaZulu in the province of Natal. KwaZulu was a one-party state run by the Inkatha Freedom Party of Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He was refusing to take part in the election and could pull perhaps 3 million Zulus out with him.
Chief Buthelezi was a greater threat to the process than Terra Blanche because Chief Buthelezi did have a base. He had an ethnic base, a base which had as its main content political backwardness among some of his constituents, but he did have a base and he was able to do damage.
Another tribal state was part of the alliance with the white right. Bophuthatswana, known as Bop, was largely rural and poor. Yet the main threat to the transition was to come from here. Bop was scattered over 7 areas. Its showpiece was the capital, Maputo. The country had been recognized by South Africa as an independent state, though the rest of the world and the ANC disputed this. Its president was Lucas Mangope. Under the constitution that had just been agreed, Bophuthatswana would cease to exist and become part of South Africa. Not surprisingly, Mangope refused to participate in this election.
President de Klerk came here, for instance, about 2, 3, 4 times, together with Mr. Beckbotha, to try and influence our president here to give in.
Mangope now formed a pact with General Viljoen and Chief Buthelezi. This alliance of Bop with right-wing Afrikaners posed a serious threat to the whole transition to democracy.
The white right would have territory, of Bob, access to Bob arsenals, and would have black cannon fodder through Nkata.
BOP was effectively a one-party state whose police cracked down on political protest. They would not allow the ANC to campaign there. BOP's civil servants began to realize that Mangope's government would disappear on election day, and there would be no one to pay their wages. Alarmed by this prospect, demonstrations and disorder spread through the capital, Mabato. General Jack Turner was an advisor to President Mangope.
Even the security forces were being terrorized. Their houses were being burned down. Their families were being terrorized. They didn't know exactly if they go home that evening, is their house still going to be intact?
But Mangope stood firm. When some of his black soldiers urged him to abandon his independence, he said he had powerful friends.
He warned the defense force. He said to them on that day, "Look, gentlemen, if you feel you cannot toe the line with me, give me that which is mine. And leave the defense force. I'll go and get some other people to come and be in this defense force."
The other people the BOP president counted on were Viljoen's militia of army reservists, mostly Afrikaner farmers, who were members of the broad Volksfront alliance. As disturbances in BOP continued, Mangope saw himself as the victim of a conspiracy.
For the good of South Africa, I want to expose the African National Congress, the Communist Party, and the South African government for what they are. For much too long, ever since the beginning of the negotiations, we have had secret deals between the Nationalist Party government and the Communist Party, the African National Congress.
As students rioted and his capital went out of control, Mangope called on Viljoen to come urgently to his rescue.
He then requested from me assistance for that weekend. I then said to Mr. Mangope that I am prepared to move in farmers for this purpose. Mr. Mangope then said to me, "Please, as far as the farmers are concerned, I will be very happy to have them because I believe that we have a close relationship. But please do not bring the AWB."
I emphasized to them, please come in, do not bring in the AWB.
Terre Blanche's men were regarded as rabid racists. The BOP regime added a warning.
And they all said to me that if you bring in the AWB, there might be a mutiny amongst their own people.
Despite this, Terre Blanche announced that he would help Mangope. So the whole white right was going in. The day after Terre Blanche announced his readiness to help, part of Mangope's police force mutinied and joined the demonstrators. Law enforcement ceased. Mabato's main shopping center was pillaged. Soldiers of the BOP Defense Force were nowhere to be seen.
I had a call from Mr. Eugene Terre Blanche, who offered to come in and help. And I said, please don't come in.
But the AWB were going in anyway.
6700 started here from Ventersdorp. The only firearms they had were sidearms, revolvers and pistols.
The AWB's intervention was to have dramatic consequences for the white hardliners. Viljoen's Volksfront and Terre Blanche with his AWB men arrived at the airbase near Mabato, where the AWB had already been terrorizing local blacks. Turner sent officers to fetch him.
So I said, yes, I will go in and I'll follow them, and they took me to Jack Turner.
I asked Mr. Terre Blanche, what were they doing there? And he said, they have come to help. So I said, but we did not ask for your help. And he said, your president asked for help.
Turner consulted his superiors.
And then he demands that I must leave Botswana. Me, Terre Blanche, must leave Botswana. Because I'm busy overheating the situation because of my presence. So I said to him, that's bloody nonsense.
More looting and disorder were expected at dawn. But the argument with Terre Blanche went on all night.
And I said, gentlemen, it can't carry on like this, and we want the AWB out of Mabatu as soon as possible. And I wanted them out before first light, before the people started seeing that the AWB were there. And why I knew there was going to be conflict, because the AWB was seen to be a racist type of organization. And our soldiers were, especially our soldiers, were against them being there.
When Dawn showed the white right at the airbase, the BOP soldiers' anger grew.
They wanted us to get rid of them as soon as possible. And they even said that they were preparing to attack those people if those people did not leave immediately.
Finally, the AWB agreed to leave. What happened next helped bring down the regime they had tried to save, and with it, the whole breakaway movement. As they drove out, the AWB men were in a filthy mood. They fired indiscriminately at people on street corners, killing and wounding many.
I just hear they shoot me, and I get inside the car. I was just crying. I told the people they shoot me in the leg for nothing.
This casual butchery further enraged the BOP army. The AWB were now driving out of town in several columns. Not all of them found their road clear. In one area, a crowd formed at a roadblock manned by BOP soldiers. The crowd chanted anti-AWB slogans. One of the departing AWB columns headed towards them and opened fire to clear the road. The crowd scattered. Then as the convoy drove past, an AWB man in the blue Mercedes near the back of the convoy leant from the window and took aim. BOP soldiers opened fire. In the distance, the blue Mercedes is the target for the soldiers' pent-up anger. It is riddled with bullets. With the driver fatally wounded, 2 other injured men clambered out.
Press people, please. Can you just get us some help for him, please? He's just wounded. Are you finished with your photos and stuff? Please get the ambulance now. We need the ambulance for this guy that's wounded.
But you also wanted a journalist.
Huh?
So are you a member of the AWB? Yeah. You're a member of the AWB? Yeah.
And there they murdered them. They just murdered them, what you saw on television.
Suddenly, one of the BOP policemen pumped bullets into the wounded AWB men.
3 of them were shot like dogs in the glaring publicity of television lights and cameras. That had an enormous effect on the right-wing willingness to resist the elections further by means of violence and terrorism.
And I think mothers, wives, parents for the first time realized that this talk of fighting it for a Boer start meant that their sons and daughters would be killed no matter how tough they talked.
Now you held me responsible. At least the AWB tried to help. And what is more interesting is, at least on record there it stands now, that we were willingly to die for black people, for an independent black state, Botswana.
President, is there anything you could say on this?
The government now decided to get rid of Mangope. Pik Botha, South Africa's foreign minister, and top ANC man Mac Maharaj were given the task.
We boarded a plane, flew to what was known in the old days as Mafeking, Mabatu now, and from there flew to President Mangope's residence in a helicopter at night.
The South African team entered the president's home.
And it was my duty to put it to President Mangope in a friendly, courteous, but firm way. That, look, Mr. President, it's over. And you can still participate in the elections. But you cannot simply sit here in your private residence while people are dying.
I intervened to say that the central feature of the situation was that the administration has collapsed. The public refused to acknowledge his administration's authority.
You know, Mr. Pickwater came accompanied by Mr. Maharaj, who apparently came to ensure that Mr. Botha carried out his instructions, Mr. Maharaj's instructions.
Mangope refused to even address me, but realized that the game was up, and he then expressed extreme disquiet and with Pickwater, said he felt betrayed by Pickwater.
He then asked whether he could not address his people, and I said it would serve no purpose. It's gone.
They would not allow me to address my people and tell them that I had told Botha, that I had told Maharaj, that they do not have the right to remove me. They have no legal or constitutional right to remove me. They would not allow me that.
The delegation reported to their political bosses.
Mangope was very arrogant, and they told him, from now on, you are no longer president of Botswana. He then, of course, broke down and collapsed. And once a statement was made that Mangope had been deposed, then, of course, the right wing itself collapsed.
For Viljoen, Terre Blanche's conduct had been the final straw. Now he instructed his followers to vote, and he registered his party for the election. Only one threat to a peaceful transition remained, but it was a dangerous one. Chief Buthelezi got his Inkatha Freedom Party ready to enforce a boycott of the elections. He wanted KwaZulu in Natal province to break away from South Africa.
There was a demand for what really amounted to a form of almost full independence for the Zulu kingdom.
The government and ANC rejected these demands. Conflict between Buthelez's supporters and the ANC escalated, with hundreds killed each month. The big question was whether the election could even take place in Natal. Mandela decided to put his prestige on the line and approach Buthelezi in a plea for peace.
The essence of my appeal to him was that whoever was wrong or right at the beginning, history will indict us for having failed to stop the slaughter of our own people. And the only thing that we can do now is to unite and to take part in the elections.
I'm not devious by nature. God didn't make me that way. So when I said we're not going to participate, I meant that we're not going to participate. Simple as that.
On March the 28th, Inkatha supporters staged an anti-election march through Johannesburg to the ANC's headquarters. There was sporadic shooting along the way. Then a volley was fired into the crowd from the ANC building. Altogether, more than 50 people died. Buthelezi said the massacre marked the start of the struggle to the end between the ANC and the Zulu nation. Now Mandela encouraged de Klerk to take decisive action to enable the long-awaited elections to go ahead.
Circumstances have arisen within the province of Natal which seriously threaten the safety of the public and the maintenance of public order. I have therefore decided to declare, in terms of the Public Safety Act of 1953, a state of emergency in the area mentioned.
The government moved troops into KwaZulu and would not budge. With less than a month to go before the election, Buthelezi was faced with a stark decision.
There was a realization on the side of Inkatha that not participating faced them with a major choice, and that would be the choice of going to the bush. And that they realized, because the leadership of Inkatha, I sincerely believe, didn't want war and doesn't want war, that would lead them into a situation of declaring a form of war.
If he didn't squeeze into the process in that last 10 days, he would be completely and utterly eliminated from the political scene.
At the last minute, Mandela and de Klerk made a few face-saving offers that left Buthelezi with no room for maneuver.
They agreed also that as soon as possible after elections, that there would be international mediation. It was on that basis. Because then, for me, from the point of view of a politician, it was very stupid of me at that point, without canvassing, without voter education, without any money, to then undertake to participate in an election, even a few days' time. But I had no excuse whatsoever for not doing so.
With 8 days to go, a great burden of fear was lifted. The threat of the country descending into chaos finally receded. In Carter, the election's last formidable opponent would participate. To add them to the ballot paper, 80 million stickers had to be printed. More than 19 million people voted. The ANC won 63%, the National Party 20%, in Carter 10%. 5 years earlier, Mandela had been a prisoner in a cell. He and his colleagues in the ANC had struggled to outwit the fanatical opposition of the white right. Their opponents in the tribal states, and the attempts by the ruling National Party to use these forces to frustrate majority rule.
It is, of course, not easy for a party which has been in power for 45 years to surrender power.
On May the 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first president of a democratic South Africa. The whole world, from US Vice President Al Gore to Fidel Castro, came to Pretoria, the capital, which for half a century had been an international outcast. Old allies, new ministers, and former enemies were all present. Mandela's new government included both ex-hardline communist Joe Slovo and the old adversary of the ANC, former President F.W. de Klerk. Mandela's inaugural speech embraced all the people of this newly reborn nation.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa. I thank you.